Lieutenant Jack Moresby counted 8 minutes and 40 seconds from the first rifle crack until Japanese reinforcements emerged from the tree line like ants boiling out of a disturbed nest. He'd timed it 3 times now, and the pattern never varied. If this format speaks to you, subscribe and support the video. The problem wasn't the fighting itself. Moresby's men from the 9th Division could handle a straight firefight against Japanese defenders dug into bunkers along the Finschhafen approach. They'd proven that much in the desert against Rommel's Africa Corps. New Guinea was different terrain, sure. Jungle instead of sand, humidity that rotted boots off your feet, malaria mosquitoes thick as fog. But combat was combat. You fixed bayonets, you advanced, you killed the enemy, or he killed you. Simple mathematics. What wasn't simple was this. Every time Australian troops committed to an assault, within 10 minutes the defenders signaled their positions with colored smoke, and Japanese reserves materialized from positions inland. White plumes rose from artillery emplacements. Red smoke billowed from infantry strongpoints under pressure. Yellow marked the logistics dumps when they needed resupply. The smoke spoke a language the Australians couldn't interrupt, and it turned every attack into a countdown. Take your objective in under 8 minutes, or face fresh troops with full ammunition stores and murder in their eyes. Moresby crouched behind a fallen ironwood tree on the ridge overlooking what the maps called Hill 372. His uniform clung to him like a second skin, soaked through with sweat that attracted every biting insect in the Huon Peninsula. Below, the previous night's assault had left corpses scattered across the slope, 14 Australians who'd almost reached the Japanese bunkers before the reinforcements arrived. Now the bodies were bloating in the tropical heat, and the burial detail would have to go out after dark because Japanese snipers owned the daylight hours. The smell reached them even up on the ridge, sweet and rotten, mixing with the jungle's own decay, fallen fruit, fungus-covered logs, the mulch of leaves turning to soil. Moresby had stopped noticing most jungle smells after 2 months in country, but dead men smelled different. Dead men smelled like failure. Like plans that collapsed, and orders that got boys killed, and reports that went up the chain explaining why the objective remained in enemy hands. Sergeant McKinnon settled in beside him, breathing hard from the climb. The sergeant was 42, ancient for infantry work, with a face like weathered teak and a Glasgow accent that 20 years in Australia hadn't softened. Quote 0, he spat into the undergrowth. Quote 1. Moresby kept his binoculars trained on the enemy positions. 3 bunker complexes, mutually supporting, with interlocking fields of fire that turned the approach into a killing ground. Standard Japanese defensive doctrine. The intelligence briefings said the garrison numbered maybe 80 men, which meant Australian doctrine called for a 3-to-1 advantage in the assault. Easy on paper. Except those 80 men could call up another 40 from the reserve positions within 9 minutes, which meant you needed to calculate force ratios against 120 defenders, which meant you needed 360 attackers, which the battalion didn't have after the losses they'd already taken. Quote 2, Moresby said. Quote 3. Quote 4. McKinnon pulled out a cigarette, then remembered where they were and put it away. Smoke would draw sniper fire. Quote 5. The point was buried in Moresby's head like a splinter he couldn't extract. Something about the clockwork precision bothered him. Modern armies ran on logistics and communication, sure, but 9 minutes response time suggested the Japanese had their reserve positions pre-planned, their routes rehearsed, their signals understood instantly. No confusion, no hesitation. The colored smoke went up, and the reinforcements moved like they were following railway schedules. Down on the slope, a bird, some kind of parrot, bright green against the darker foliage, landed on one of the corpses. McKinnon raised his rifle instinctively, then lowered it. Waste of ammunition. The bird picked at the dead soldier's webbing, looking for food scraps, then flew off disappointed. "Their smoke signals are too good," Moresby said finally. "They don't argue about what the colors mean. They don't send runners to confirm. They see red smoke, and they know exactly what it means, exactly where to go, exactly how many men to send." McKinnon squinted at him. "And that bothers you because anything that reliable can be used against them." Corporal Tommy Davies had never intended to become an expert on Japanese smoke grenades. He'd joined the army to get away from his father's sheep station in Queensland, where the work was endless and the conversation non-existent. The army promised adventure, which turned out to be a polite word for malaria, trench foot, and watching your mates die in places that didn't appear on any map back home. The raid on the coastal artillery position happened on the 23rd of September, a Tuesday, though days of the week had stopped meaning much. Captain Hendricks led 2 sections, 20 men total, on what the briefing called a reconnaissance in force, which everyone understood meant they were supposed to poke the enemy hard enough to see what happened. The target was a 75mm gun emplacement that had been dropping shells on the supply road for 3 days straight. They moved out at 0300, navigating by compass through jungle so thick that visibility dropped to arm's length. Davies carried the Bren gun, 28 pounds of weapon plus ammunition, and by the time they reached the objective, his shoulders felt like someone had driven nails through them. The gun position sat in a clearing hacked from the jungle, sandbags stacked in a horseshoe around the artillery piece. 4 Japanese soldiers visible, probably another 6 in the dugouts behind. Hendricks gave the signal, and they opened up. The Bren gun chattered in Davies' hands, spent casings arcing into the undergrowth. Rifle fire from both sides turned the clearing into a confusion of muzzle flashes and shouted orders. One of the Japanese gunners went down, then another. The Australians pushed forward, following doctrine, trying to close the distance before the defenders could organize. That's when Davies saw the first smoke grenade. A Japanese soldier, couldn't have been more than 19, 20 years old, pulled something from his webbing and threw it toward the jungle's edge before a bullet caught him in the chest. Yellow smoke began pouring out, thick and acrid, spreading like a stain. 30 seconds later, another grenade went off. This one produced red smoke, darker, almost crimson in the pre-dawn light. The Japanese defenders were pulling back now, abandoning the gun position, retreating into prepared positions deeper in the clearing. Standard tactics. Make the attackers pay for every yard. But Davies kept watching the smoke. Yellow on the left side of the position, red on the right. 2 distinct colors, 2 distinct locations. That seemed deliberate. The defenders weren't just signaling for help. They were providing specific information. Where they needed support. What kind of support. The Australian attack stalled when Japanese reinforcements arrived from 2 directions simultaneously. Fresh troops, probably from the reserve positions everyone knew existed but could never locate precisely. They hit the Australian flanks hard enough that Hendricks ordered withdrawal. 3 men stayed behind, dead. Davies hauled the Bren gun back through the jungle, along with something else. One of the spent smoke canisters he'd grabbed during the retreat. Nobody noticed at first. Back at the company position, exhausted men collapsed into whatever shelter they could find. The medics worked on the wounded. 2 men had taken shrapnel. Another had a through-and-through bullet wound in his thigh. Hendricks wrote his report, mechanical and bloodless. Objective not secured. Enemy strength greater than anticipated. Recommend additional reconnaissance before next attempt. Davies sat in his dugout and examined the canister. Japanese characters stamped on the side, which he couldn't read. But the construction was simple enough. Metal cylinder about the size of a beer bottle with a striker mechanism on the bottom. Pull the pin, throw it, smoke came out. He'd seen similar equipment in training, British-made smoke grenades for signaling or concealment. This one had produced yellow smoke, he was certain of that. Over the next 2 days, he started paying attention during other engagements. A platoon from B Company attacked a bunker complex on the 25th. Davies watched from the company position through binoculars he'd borrowed from the signals officer. When the attack went in, Japanese defenders threw smoke grenades, white this time. And instead of reinforcements arriving, stretcher bearers appeared from the Japanese rear positions, moving quickly to evacuate wounded. White meant medical. Yellow meant something else, supplies maybe, or ammunition. Red meant reinforcements needed immediately. The pattern held across multiple observations. The Japanese were using colored smoke as a battlefield communication system, faster than runners, more reliable than radio in the jungle where reception was intermittent at best. Davies mentioned it to Sergeant McKinnon on the 27th, casually, not wanting to sound like he was teaching tactics to a man who'd been soldiering since before Davies was born. McKinnon listened, nodded, said he'd pass it up the chain. Nothing came back down. Intelligence officers were busy with bigger concerns: Japanese troop movements, supply routes, defensive preparations for the expected Allied advance. Then Lieutenant Moresby showed up at Davies's dugout on the evening of the 30th. Young officer, maybe 24, with the look of someone who'd been thinking too hard about problems that didn't have easy answers. He carried a notebook and a pencil worn down to a stub. "Sergeant McKinnon says you've been collecting Japanese smoke canisters," Moresby said without preamble. "Says you've got theories about what the colors mean." Davies showed him the canisters. He'd acquired 3 more during patrols and scrounging through areas where fighting had occurred: yellow, red, white, and 1 green canister he hadn't seen deployed yet. Moresby examined each one, making notes. "You're certain about the pattern? Red for reinforcements, white for medical, yellow for resupply." "Certain as I can be without speaking Japanese, sir. I've watched them use it 6 times now. Pattern holds every time." "And this?" Moresby held up the green canister. "Don't know yet. Haven't seen it used." Moresby was quiet for a long moment, turning the canister over in his hands. Then he looked at Davies with an expression that was half excitement, half something darker. "What if we used their signals against them?" The raid happened on October 4th, unauthorized and technically mutinous if anyone cared to press charges. Moresby picked 12 men from his platoon, volunteers only, and told them the plan was probably insane, but might save lives if it worked. Nobody backed out. They'd all lost friends to the 8-minute reinforcement cycle. The target was a bunker complex 2 miles north of the main Australian positions, isolated enough that Japanese response would be predictable. Intelligence reported 6 to 8 defenders, probably a listening post watching the coastal approach. Standard doctrine said you needed at least 20 men to assault fortified positions. Moresby was taking 12 and betting everything on confusion. They moved out at dawn, which violated every rule about jungle operations. Darkness was safer, harder for the enemy to spot approaching troops. But Moresby needed daylight for what he planned. Needed the Japanese to see the smoke clearly. Needed them to react the way they'd been trained. Private Collins walked point, a kid from Melbourne who could move through jungle like he'd grown up in it instead of city streets. Behind him came Corporal Davies with the captured smoke canisters, then Moresby, then the rest of the section spread out in a loose formation that would tighten when they hit the objective. They carried minimum equipment: rifles, grenades, ammunition, water bottles, nothing that would slow them down. The bunker complex sat where a small ridge overlooked a creek bed, probably chosen because it gave good sight lines down the valley. 2 bunkers visible, maybe more hidden in the foliage. Weapon slits cut into logs and sandbags, firing positions that covered the approach from multiple angles. Through binoculars, Moresby spotted 2 Japanese soldiers outside the bunkers, working on something he couldn't identify at this distance. Routine work. Guards who didn't expect trouble this early in the day. He checked his watch. 06:23. They had until 06:30 to get into position. Davies crawled forward, carrying 3 of the captured smoke canisters. Yellow smoke grenades, the ones that signaled resupply needed. The plan was simple in concept, complicated in execution. Davies would throw the yellow smoke 200 yards west of the actual bunker position. The Japanese inside would hear the grenades deploy, see yellow smoke rising from the jungle, and, if Moresby's theory held, assume one of their supply points needed ammunition or food. The real assault would come from the east, hitting the bunkers while any reinforcements headed west toward the false signal. 8 minutes to take the position before someone figured out the deception. Maybe less if the defenders were smart. Davies reached his position and raised his hand. Ready. Moresby signaled the assault team, 8 men who would hit the bunkers the moment the smoke went up. The remaining 3 would provide covering fire from the tree line. Simple plan. Simple plans usually failed, but complicated ones failed faster. At 06:30 exactly, Davies pulled the pins and threw. 3 yellow smoke canisters arced through the air and landed in heavy jungle west of the bunker complex. They ignited with small pops, like firecrackers, and yellow smoke began pouring out. Thick chemical smoke that rose above the jungle canopy, visible for hundreds of yards. The two Japanese soldiers outside the bunkers looked toward the smoke immediately. One of them shouted something, probably alerting the men inside. They stood there for maybe 10 seconds, staring at the yellow plumes, clearly uncertain. Then one ran toward the bunkers, while the other started moving west, toward the smoke. Moresby didn't wait. He gave the signal and the assault team went in, firing as they moved. The Japanese soldier heading west went down in the first volley. The other made it inside one bunker, and suddenly rifle fire was coming from the weapon slits. Not aimed fire, panic shooting from defenders who'd just realized they were under attack from the wrong direction. Private Hammond threw grenades through one bunker's firing slit. The explosions were muffled thuds, followed by silence. The second bunker kept shooting, bullets clipping through leaves and bark. Davies brought the Bren gun up and poured rounds into the opening until the return fire stopped. 4 minutes elapsed. The assault team cleared the first bunker, 3 Japanese dead, 1 wounded and unconscious. The second bunker was empty, except for corpses. Behind both bunkers they found a third position, more of a dugout than a proper bunker, with maps and radio equipment. Nobody inside. Either the occupants had run or they'd never been there. 6 minutes. Moresby ordered the men to grab anything useful, maps, documents, the radio if they could carry it. They worked fast, stuffing papers into packs, smashing equipment they couldn't take. The wounded Japanese soldier got a morphine shot and a field dressing, hands tied. He'd be interrogated back at base if he survived. 7 minutes. No reinforcements. The jungle remained quiet except for bird calls and the distant sound of artillery from the main front. Moresby kept checking the approaches, waiting for Japanese troops to appear, but nothing moved. Either the reinforcements had gone to the false smoke signal and were still searching for a supply point that didn't exist, or the bunker complex had been too isolated to call for help. They withdrew at 7 minutes 40 seconds, carrying the wounded prisoner and whatever intelligence they'd grabbed. The trip back took nearly an hour, moving carefully through jungle that might hold enemy patrols. Nobody spoke. Combat was like that, all noise and chaos during the fight, then silence afterward, while your brain tried to process what had just happened. Back at the company position, Moresby reported to Captain Hendricks, who listened with an expression that cycled through surprise, anger, and something that might have been grudging respect. You conducted an unauthorized raid on enemy positions using captured equipment in a tactical deception that could have gotten your entire section killed. Yes, sir. And you're reporting this to me instead of trying to hide it because it worked, sir. We took the objective with 0 friendly casualties. The Japanese responded exactly how we predicted. They sent reinforcements to the false signal. Hendricks was quiet for a long moment. Outside the dugout, someone was cooking something over a fire. Bully beef, probably. The canned meat that tasted like salted boot leather. You don't know that they sent reinforcements. You don't know that anyone fell for your smoke trick. Maybe that bunker was just undermanned. Maybe you got lucky. Maybe, sir. Or maybe we just figured out how to beat their 8-minute response time. Major Hutchins commanded the 2nd Battalion with the demeanor of a man who'd stopped being impressed by clever ideas around 1917 on the Somme. He was 51, gray-haired, with a limp from shrapnel that had never properly healed, and a reputation for caring more about results than regulations. When Moresby presented himself at battalion headquarters on October 6th, Hutchins was reading casualty reports and didn't look up for a full minute. Captain Hendricks says you've invented a new way to get men killed, Hutchins said finally. He also says it might actually work, which makes him nervous because Hendricks doesn't trust things that sound too good. Neither do I. Moresby had prepared a formal presentation. Maps, timeline, analysis of Japanese smoke signal patterns based on Davies' observations. Hutchins waved it away. Moresby chose his words carefully. Hutchins had a reputation for despising officers who wasted his time with half-formed theories. Quote 28, quote 29, quote 30. Hutchins leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. Outside the headquarters tent, someone was shouting about a supply truck that had gotten stuck in the mud. The whole camp smelled like diesel fuel and rotting vegetation. Quote 31, quote 32, quote 33. But Hutchins's tone had shifted slightly, less hostile, more calculating. How many captured smoke canisters do we have? Corporal Davies has collected 17, sir. Different colors, different conditions. Some still functional, some not. We need more for a battalion-level operation. And how do you propose acquiring more? We can't exactly order them from supply. Moresby had anticipated this question. Raids, sir. Small unit actions targeting Japanese supply dumps and logistics positions. We take the smoke grenades along with whatever else we find. Turn every patrol into an acquisition opportunity. Hutchins stood and walked to the map table that dominated one corner of the headquarters tent. The map showed the entire Huon Peninsula campaign area, covered with colored pins indicating Australian positions in blue, Japanese in red, contested areas in yellow. He studied it for a long moment, then tapped a location north of Finschhafen. We're planning a major assault on the Saddleberg Ridges, 17th of October. 3 companies, supporting artillery, the whole show. Objective is to break through Japanese defensive lines and open the road to Wario. Intelligence estimates will face 200 defenders with another 100 in reserve positions. He turned to face Moresby. Those reserve positions are the problem. We commit to the assault, Japanese smoke signals go up, reserves flood in, our attack bogs down. We've run this scenario 3 times in the past month. Each time, same result. Heavy casualties, minimal gains, withdrawal to start positions. Moresby understood where this was going before Hutchins finished speaking. You want to test the smoke deception during a battalion assault. I want you to prove it works or prove it doesn't. No more unauthorized raids, no more small-scale experiments. You'll coordinate with all 3 assault companies. You'll have access to captured smoke grenades. I'll authorize raids to acquire more. You'll plan the deception, execute it, and deliver results. Hutchins paused. And if it fails, if men die because they counted on Japanese reinforcements going to the wrong positions, you'll face a court-martial for endangering troops under combat conditions. The headquarters tent felt suddenly smaller. Outside, rain had started falling, the heavy tropical downpour that turned everything to mud within minutes. Moresby thought about the 14 bodies on Hill 372, about Private Collins, who could move through jungle like a ghost, about Davies and his collection of smoke canisters. Thought about what happens when clever theories meet actual combat. I'll need full cooperation from company commanders, sir. Authority to position smoke teams wherever the tactical situation requires. And I'll need Davies. He understands the Japanese signal system better than anyone. You'll have what you need. You'll also have responsibility for the outcome. Hutchins returned to his desk and picked up a pen, signaled that the meeting was ending. 17th of October, 0530 hours. The assault goes in regardless of your deception plan. If you can reduce our casualties, I'll personally recommend you for promotion. If you get men killed through incompetence, I'll see you broken to private. Those are your options. Moresby saluted and left, walking out into rain that soaked through his uniform in seconds. He had 11 days to turn a theory into operational doctrine, to convince company commanders to trust a scheme that sounded like something from a boy's adventure novel, to acquire enough captured smoke grenades to deceive an entire Japanese defensive network. 11 days to prove that colored smoke could beat bullets, or 11 days until a lot of men died trusting him. Training for chaos turned out to be harder than training for conventional assault. The company commanders listened to Moresby's briefing on October 7th with expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. Captain Hendricks supported the plan, mostly because he'd seen the bunker raid succeed. Captain Morris from B Company called it, quote, 46, quote, and said he wouldn't risk his men on smoke and mirrors. Captain Webb from C Company just wanted to know how many extra smoke grenades his men would have to carry. The fundamental problem was timing. Australian infantry doctrine emphasized coordinated assault, artillery preparation, then infantry advance under covering fire, then consolidation of objectives. Everything choreographed, everything planned down to the minute. Moresby's deception required throwing that choreography into deliberate disarray. Smoke teams would deploy false signals at different times, different locations, creating multiple phantom crises for Japanese defenders to respond to. Quote, 47, Mors said during the planning session on October 8th. Quote, 48. Moresby had anticipated resistance. He'd brought Davies to the briefing, along with captured smoke canisters and documentation of every observed Japanese signal pattern over the past month. Davies spread it out on the table, 17 separate engagements, colour-coded by smoke type, annotated with response times and reinforcement strength. Red smoke brings infantry reinforcements. Average response time, 8 to 9 minutes, Davies explained, pointing to the data. White brings medical personnel. Faster response, usually 4 to 5 minutes. Yellow brings logistics support. Slower, sometimes 15 minutes. We've documented this across multiple sectors, different Japanese units, different tactical situations. The pattern holds. Webb studied the documentation, running his finger down the columns of times and observations. This is solid intelligence work, but intelligence and combat are different animals. You're making assumptions about enemy behavior under stress. We're making predictions based on observed patterns, Moresby corrected. The Japanese have drilled this system until it's automatic. That's its strength and its weakness. They don't waste time verifying signals because verification costs minutes they don't have. We're going to exploit that automation. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Carver, Webb's second-in-command, had fought in Malaya before the surrender in 1942. He'd spent 6 months in a POW camp before escaping during a transfer and making his way to Australia through Indonesia. He'd watched Japanese military operations from both sides. Carver said quietly. Morris wasn't convinced. And when they figure out we're using their signals against them, when they realize red smoke might mean attack instead of defend, you've just taught them to ignore their own communication system. That's not a victory, that's chaos that hurts both sides. But it hurts them more, Moresby argued. We're attacking. We can plan for chaos because we're creating it. They're defending, reacting to our initiative. Uncertainty favors the attacker. The planning sessions continued over the next 3 days. Maps covered every surface in the battalion headquarters tent. Topographic maps showing the Saddleberg ridges, tactical maps with Japanese positions marked in red, hand-drawn sketches showing approach routes and fields of fire. Moresby worked 16-hour days, coordinating with artillery officers about timing, with intelligence about enemy positions, with supply sergeants about smoke grenade acquisition. Acquiring more captured smoke grenades became everyone's secondary mission. Patrols went out with orders to target Japanese supply points. A raid on October 10th netted 23 smoke canisters from an abandoned logistics dump. Another patrol on the 11th exchanged fire with Japanese troops and grabbed 11 more canisters from the bodies. By October 14th, they had 68 captured smoke grenades in various colours, stored in ammunition crates and catalogued by type. The assault teams practiced with stopwatches and hand signals because radio communication in the jungle was unreliable. Smoke teams, 2 men each, positioned at predetermined locations, would watch for specific signals from the assault leaders. When the attack commenced, they'd have between 30 seconds and 2 minutes to deploy false smoke signals before the real assault hit Japanese positions. Too early, and the Japanese would see through the deception, spot the actual assault developing, and adjust accordingly. Too late, and reinforcements would already be responding to legitimate signals from defenders. The window was narrow and unforgiving. Private Collins, who'd walked point on the bunker raid, asked the question that worried everyone. _quote_59_. Nobody had a good answer. Intelligence couldn't intercept Japanese smoke signals. You had to see them, and by the time you saw them, you were usually under fire. The data Davies had collected was solid, but ultimately incomplete. They were betting lives on patterns that might have shifted. On October 15th, 2 days before the assault, Major Hutchins called Moresby to headquarters. The major looked like he hadn't slept, which probably meant he hadn't. "I've been thinking about your court-martial. Sir, if this works, you're a tactical innovator. If it fails, you're the officer who convinced me to authorize a scheme that got men killed. I've been in this army long enough to know that success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan." Hutchins pulled out a bottle of whiskey from his desk drawer, poured 2 glasses, and slid one across to Moresby. "So I want to be clear. You believe in this deception. You're not just gambling with other men's lives because it sounds clever." Moresby took the glass but didn't drink. Quote 64. Hutchins drank his whiskey in one swallow. Quote 66. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the camp was settling into evening routine, fires being lit, rations distributed, men cleaning weapons and writing letters home. Normal sounds of an army preparing for battle. Quote 68, Hutchins said finally. Quote 69. The morning of October 17th arrived with fog so thick that visibility dropped to 20 yards. Moresby stood in the assembly area at 0400 hours, watching 300 men prepare for an assault they couldn't see yet. The fog was both blessing and curse. It would conceal their approach, but it would also make coordination nearly impossible. Hand signals wouldn't work. Visual confirmation of smoke deployments would be delayed. The entire deception plan assumed clear sightlines. Sergeant McKinnon appeared out of the fog like a ghost. Quote 70. Quote 71. Quote 72. Moresby had no answer for that. Weather in New Guinea followed its own logic, indifferent to military timetables. He'd seen fog linger until mid-morning, seen it vanish in minutes under tropical sun. Betting on weather was like betting on dice, but they were committed now. 3 companies waiting in the fog, artillery crews preparing firing solutions, medical teams standing by for casualties. The plan deployed smoke teams at 6 locations around the Japanese defensive perimeter. Each team carried captured smoke grenades, red for reinforcements needed, the signal most likely to draw Japanese reserves away from actual fighting. The teams had memorized their positions during daylight reconnaissance, but finding those exact spots in fog-shrouded jungle would require navigation skills and considerable luck. At 0430, the assault companies moved to their jump-off positions. A Company under Hendricks would hit the left flank of the Japanese defenses. B Company under Morris would strike the center. C Company under Webb would assault the right flank and then wheel to envelop any defenders who retreated inland. Standard maneuver warfare, except for the smoke teams positioned to create phantom emergencies across the battlefield. Corporal Davies commanded Smoke Team 1, positioned 800 yards north of the actual assault line. His job was simple in concept. When he heard artillery fire signaling the assault's commencement, he'd deploy 3 red smoke grenades in quick succession, creating the impression of a major attack developing on the Japanese northern flank. In theory, enemy reserves stationed inland would respond to that signal, moving north instead of reinforcing the positions actually under attack. In practice, Davies was crouched in jungle fog with Private Hammond, trying to identify landmarks he'd memorized 2 days ago in clear weather. A distinctive rock formation should be 30 yards to his left. A fallen tree should mark his southern boundary. Instead, he saw gray fog and vague shapes that might be rocks or might be shadows. Quote 73, Hammond whispered. Quote 74. Davies checked his compass for the 5th time. The bearing was correct, but compass bearings meant nothing if your starting point was wrong. Quote 75. The other 5 smoke teams were scattered across the Japanese perimeter, each facing the same problem. Smoke Team 3, commanded by Private Wilson, had gotten lost entirely in the fog and was navigating by dead reckoning toward where they thought their position should be. Smoke Team 5 had found their reference point, a distinctive palm tree struck by lightning, but couldn't see far enough to deploy smoke where Japanese observers would spot it. At 0500 hours, the fog began to thin slightly. Visibility improved to maybe 50 yards, still inadequate, but better than before. Moresby, positioned with A Company's command group, could now see the assault troops formed up in their start lines. Faces he recognized, Collins on point, McKinnon checking weapons, young soldiers who joined the battalion 3 weeks ago and still looked like they belonged in school. 05:15. Artillery observers reported they could barely see their target coordinates. Major Hutchins, commanding from a position behind the assault line, sent a runner asking if Moresby wanted to delay. Moresby sent the runner back with a negative. Delays meant the Japanese might spot the assembling forces, might reinforce their positions preemptively, might shift their defensive arrangements in ways that invalidated all the reconnaissance. 05:25. The fog was definitely lifting now, burning off under the sun that was rising somewhere beyond the cloud cover. Visibility extended to 100 yards, then 150. Davies could see his rock formation now, and the fallen tree. He was 70 yards north of where he should be, but close enough. He hand-signaled Hammond, "Prepare smoke grenades." 05:30 exactly. Australian artillery opened up with a barrage that turned the jungle into thunder. Shells screamed overhead and impacted on Japanese positions with percussive force that Moresby felt in his chest. The bombardment would last 5 minutes, long enough to suppress defenders, not long enough to give them time to organize deep fallback positions. Davies pulled the pins on 3 red smoke grenades and threw them in a tight pattern. The grenades ignited with their characteristic pops, and red smoke began billowing up, thick chemical clouds that rose above the thinning fog. From Japanese positions, the smoke would look like a major assault developing on their northern perimeter, far from where the actual attack was coming. Smoke Team 2 deployed their grenades 700 yards to the northeast. More red smoke, another phantom crisis. Smoke Team 4, positioned to the west, threw their grenades and then discovered they'd miscalculated. The smoke was rising in a small depression where Japanese observers probably couldn't see it. Team leader Corporal Matthews made a snap decision and threw 3 more grenades on higher ground, depleting his entire supply but ensuring visibility. Smoke Team 3 was still lost in the fog. At 05:35, as the artillery barrage reached its crescendo, the 3 assault companies went forward. Hendricks led A Company into the teeth of the Japanese left flank. Rifle fire erupted from hidden positions, the distinctive crack of Arisaka rifles mixing with the deeper bark of Australian Lee Enfields. Men went down in the first 30 seconds, 2 killed instantly, one screaming with a shattered leg, another clutching his throat where a bullet had opened his carotid. But the expected reinforcements didn't arrive. The Japanese defenders fought hard from their prepared positions, but they fought alone. No fresh troops appeared from the inland reserves. The defensive line held for 6 minutes, then began to crack under sustained Australian pressure. Hendricks's men reached the first bunker complex and cleared it with grenades and bayonets. Morris's B Company hit the center and found lighter resistance than expected. The Japanese had pulled back, possibly responding to the red smoke signals on their northern perimeter, possibly just executing a planned withdrawal. Either way, B Company advanced 200 yards in the first 10 minutes, far faster than any previous assault in this sector. Webb's C Company encountered the heaviest fighting on the right flank, where Japanese defenders had prepared interlocking fields of fire that turned the approach into a killing zone. The company took 14 casualties in the first 5 minutes, including Lieutenant Carver, who took a bullet through the shoulder and kept directing his platoon until blood loss forced the medics to drag him to cover. But even on the right flank, the Japanese reinforcements were absent or delayed. At 0600 hours, 30 minutes into the assault, Australian forces held positions they'd failed to take in 3 previous attempts. The defensive line was broken. Japanese troops were retreating in disorder towards secondary positions inland. Radio intercepts, analysed later, showed Japanese commanders had sent units north and northeast in response to the red smoke signals, creating gaps in their defensive line exactly where Australian troops struck. The deception had worked. The question was whether it would work again. The intelligence reports came back on October 20th, 3 days after the Saddleberg assault. Japanese prisoners interrogated at division headquarters confirmed what radio intercepts had suggested. Their commanders had responded to multiple red smoke signals on the morning of the 17th, deploying reserve units to positions where no actual Australian attacks materialised. By the time they realised the deception, Australian forces had broken through their primary defensive line. Major Hutchins called it the most cost-effective tactical innovation he'd seen in 25 years of soldiering. The Saddleburg assault achieved its objectives with 41 casualties, 19 dead, 22 wounded, compared to projections of 70 to 90 casualties for a conventional attack on the same positions. The numbers were clinical, but Moresby knew each number represented someone. Private Collins had taken shrapnel to his leg and would probably limp for the rest of his life. Sergeant McKinnon had lost 2 fingers to a grenade blast. Lieutenant Carver was on a hospital ship heading back to Australia. But 41 was better than 70. That arithmetic mattered to the families who wouldn't receive telegrams, to the men who'd keep their limbs and lives, to the battalion that retained combat strength instead of bleeding away on failed assaults. Word spread through the division with the speed of all good rumours. By October 23rd, officers from other battalions were requesting briefings on smoke deception tactics. By the 25th, Division Headquarters had issued a formal directive. All units operating in the Huon Peninsula sector would incorporate smoke deception into their tactical planning where feasible. Corporal Davies found himself giving lectures to company-level officers, explaining the Japanese signal system with the careful precision of someone who'd learned it through observation rather than manuals. The Americans heard about it too. A Marine Corps liaison officer visited on October 27th and spent 4 hours talking to Moresby about implementation details. Quote, 76, the Marine said, a captain named Rodriguez who looked about 19 despite his rank. Quote, 77, elegant work. That was already starting to fail. On October 30th, an Australian patrol used captured red smoke grenades during a raid on a Japanese supply depot. The defenders ignored the signals completely, didn't send reinforcements, and repelled the attack with coordinated fire from prepared positions. 5 Australians dead for nothing. On November 2nd, a company-level assault near Gusika employed smoke deception tactics and walked into an ambush. The Japanese had anticipated the false signals, positioned forces to counter both the deception and the real attack, and inflicted 28 casualties before the Australians withdrew. The company commander, Captain Barrett, sent an angry message to battalion headquarters. The enemy had adapted, and continuing to use compromised tactics was criminal negligence. Moresby studied the after-action reports and saw the pattern emerging. The Japanese weren't stupid. They'd realized their smoke signal system had been compromised and were adjusting accordingly. Some units had stopped using colored smoke entirely, relying instead on runners and radio communication despite the delays. Other units had changed their signal protocols. Red no longer meant reinforcements in some sectors, or meant something entirely different, or was used as a deliberate deception to draw Australian forces into prepared killing zones. The tactical advantage was eroding in real time. Intelligence officers tracked the changes across different Japanese units and sectors. By mid-November, the effectiveness of smoke deception had dropped from roughly 70% success rate to maybe 40%. Still useful, still worth attempting, but no longer the decisive edge it had been at Saddleburg. Davies took the decline personally. He'd built his expertise on understanding Japanese signals, and now that understanding was becoming obsolete. Quote 78. He explained during a briefing on November 15th. Quote 79. The evolution became more complex as both sides adapted. Australian units started deploying smoke in timed sequences, multiple colors in specific patterns, trying to add credibility to their deceptions. Japanese defenders responded by creating false signals themselves, trying to draw Australian forces into traps. The battlefield became a maze of real signals, and false signals pretending to be real signals. By early December, some Australian officers questioned whether smoke deception was worth the effort anymore. The Japanese had caught on. The element of surprise was gone. Continuing to use compromised tactics just gave the enemy opportunities to exploit Australian predictability. But intelligence analysis revealed something unexpected. Even though effectiveness had declined, the deception still created hesitation. Japanese commanders who'd been burned by false smoke signals now questioned all smoke signals, even legitimate ones. Their response times had slowed from 8 minutes to 12, sometimes 15. They were checking, verifying, sending scouts before committing reinforcements. The smoke deception had introduced systemic uncertainty into their defensive coordination. Captain Morris, the officer who'd initially called the plan circus tricks, put it bluntly during a commander's conference on December 8th. They don't trust their own signals anymore. We broke their communication system not by destroying it, but by making it unreliable. That's worth something, even if we can't predict exactly what anymore. The doctrine evolved accordingly. Smoke deception became one tool among many, rather than a primary tactic. Australian assault plans incorporated it opportunistically, use it when the situation allowed, abandon it when the enemy showed signs of anticipation, vary the patterns enough to prevent predictability. The captured smoke grenades became standard equipment, carried routinely like any other ammunition. On December 19th, Moresby received orders transferring him to division headquarters as a tactical planning officer. The promotion came with a captain's rank and responsibilities that would keep him away from frontline operations. He should have been pleased. Staff positions were safer, offered better prospects for advancement, got you away from the mud and the casualties and the constant grinding stress of combat command. Instead, he felt like he was abandoning something unfinished. The smoke deception worked, then stopped working, then worked differently. The tactical landscape kept shifting. New patterns emerged, new opportunities, new risks. Someone needed to track those changes, document them, figure out how to maintain whatever advantage still existed. He requested permission to stay with the battalion. Major Hutchins denied the request. Quote 81. Corporal Davies would stay with the battalion, continuing to refine smoke deception tactics as the campaign pushed north toward Madang and beyond. The war would continue without Moresby's direct involvement, which was how wars worked. You contributed what you could, then moved on, and other people carried the work forward, or let it die. On his last night with the battalion, Moresby walked through the camp and found Davies sitting outside his dugout, cleaning a captured Japanese smoke grenade with the careful attention someone might give a valuable tool. "They're still useful," Davies said without prompting, "just differently useful than before." Division headquarters sat 5 miles behind the front lines in what had been a coastal plantation before the war. The main house still stood, bullet-scarred and missing half its roof, converted into offices where staff officers pushed papers and argued over maps. Moresby reported on December 23rd and found himself assigned to the Tactical Development Section, which sounded impressive until he discovered it consisted of 2 other officers, 3 enlisted clerks, and a mandate to analyse innovative battlefield techniques across all units in the division. His immediate superior was Major Thompson, a former schoolteacher from Adelaide who'd spent the previous year compiling reports on everything from optimal spacing between soldiers during jungle patrols to the psychological impact of artillery barrages on defender morale. Thompson treated warfare like a mathematics problem that could be solved through sufficient data collection. Thompson explained on Moresby's first day. Battlefield innovation emerging from practical experience rather than theoretical planning. We document it, analyze effectiveness, distribute successful techniques to other units, and track how enemy forces adapt. You'll be responsible for the smoke deception portfolio. The portfolio turned out to be larger than Moresby expected. By late December, 19 Australian battalions were employing some form of smoke deception, along with 7 American units that had adopted the technique after hearing about Saddleburg. Each unit reported their experiences through after-action reports that flooded into the Tactical Development Section in stacks of carbon-copied pages smelling of mimeograph ink. Reading through the reports revealed patterns that frontline experience had missed. The Japanese weren't adapting uniformly. Different units, different commanders, different responses. Some Japanese forces had abandoned colored smoke entirely and suffered coordination problems as a result. Others had changed their signal codes but done so inconsistently, creating confusion among their own troops about what colors meant. A few units had embraced the chaos and started using smoke signals as deliberate deceptions, trying to draw Australian forces into traps. The American experience proved particularly interesting. Marine units in the Solomon Islands had tested smoke deception during operations on Bougainville in November and December. Their results showed higher success rates than contemporary Australian operations in New Guinea, possibly because Japanese forces in different theaters hadn't shared information about the compromised signals, possibly because American implementation differed in subtle ways. Captain Rodriguez, the Marine liaison officer who'd visited in October, had sent detailed reports describing how his battalion deployed captured Japanese smoke grenades during the fighting around Empress Augusta Bay. Quote, 86, Rodriguez wrote in a letter dated December 5th. Quote, 87. That observation crystallized something Moresby had been thinking about since mid-November. Overuse killed effectiveness. The more frequently smoke deception appeared, the faster enemy forces adapted. But occasional use maintained uncertainty. The Japanese couldn't ignore all smoke signals. Their defensive coordination depended on rapid communication. But they couldn't trust all signals either. The sweet spot was somewhere between constant deception and complete abandonment. Major Thompson found this analysis fascinating from a theoretical standpoint and completely useless for practical implementation. Quote, 88. The answer, Moresby realized, was that you couldn't coordinate it centrally. Battlefield conditions varied too much. What worked in one sector failed in another. The moment you created rigid doctrine, use smoke deception every third assault, or only during company-level operations, or whatever formula seemed optimal, you created predictability that enemy intelligence could exploit. The solution was deliberately unsystematic implementation. Give units the training and equipment for smoke deception, then let them decide when to use it based on local conditions and enemy behavior. No patterns, no schedules, no predictability. Pure tactical opportunism. Thompson hated the idea. You're proposing we formalize a doctrine of informality. That's contradictory. Doctrine exists to standardize effective practices. Standardization is what makes it predictable. The Japanese adapted to our smoke deception because we used it systematically. Every assault, every engagement, they learned the pattern and countered it. If there's no pattern, they can't counter effectively. The debate continued through early January 1944. Division headquarters wanted clear guidelines for smoke deception employment. The tactical development section wanted data showing optimal frequency of use. Field commanders wanted flexibility to make their own decisions without staff officers second-guessing them. Meanwhile, the technique kept evolving in unpredictable directions. An infantry company near Sio discovered that throwing white smoke, the medical evacuation signal, caused Japanese defenders to hesitate before firing on approaching soldiers, apparently concerned about shooting their own wounded. The hesitation lasted maybe 10 seconds before they realized the deception, but 10 seconds of reduced fire could save lives. Another unit found that deploying green smoke, which nobody had definitively decoded, created profound confusion among Japanese forces, who spent precious minutes trying to figure out what the signal meant. Green might have indicated chemical weapons, or specific officer presence, or something else entirely. The uncertainty was valuable regardless of the actual meaning. By mid-January, some Australian units had started manufacturing their own smoke grenades in improvised workshops, copying Japanese designs but using whatever chemicals and dyes they could scrounge. The homemade versions produced smoke that looked approximately right from a distance, which was sufficient for deception purposes. Supply officers complained about unofficial ammunition production. Field commanders ignored the complaints. The Americans took it further. Marine Corps units in the Pacific began distributing colored smoke grenades as standard equipment. Not captured Japanese versions, but American-manufactured grenades in colors matching observed Japanese signals. A signals intelligence officer in Guadalcanal had compiled a comprehensive guide to Japanese smoke protocols across different units and theaters, distributed as a classified field manual in December. Moresby read the American manual with mixed feelings. It was more thorough than anything Australian intelligence had produced, better organized, more analytically rigorous. It was also based partly on his work, on Davies's observations, on the Sattelberg assault that had proven the concept. The Americans had taken an improvised battlefield technique and systematized it, which might make it more effective or might make it more predictable. On January 24th, Moresby received a report from Davies, still serving with the battalion in New Guinea. A recent assault near Sio had used smoke deception and walked into a carefully prepared Japanese ambush. 13 men dead, 17 wounded. The Japanese commander had apparently anticipated the false signals, positioned forces accordingly, and turned the deception back against the Australians. Davies's report was clinical and precise, but Moresby could read the anger between the lines. Men had died trusting a technique that no longer worked reliably. The tactical advantage had become a tactical liability. The innovation that saved lives at Saddleburg was costing lives 4 months later. The question wasn't whether to abandon smoke deception. Units were already using it, had incorporated it into standard practice, had developed variations and refinements. The question was how to keep using it without getting predictable, how to maintain uncertainty without creating vulnerability, how to stay one step ahead of an enemy who was learning as fast as you were teaching. Moresby didn't have an answer. Neither did Thompson or anyone else at division headquarters. The battlefield was evolving faster than doctrine could track. The ambush near Sio happened on January 18th, though the detailed reports didn't reach division headquarters until the 24th. Lieutenant Baxter had commanded the assault, a platoon-strength raid on what intelligence identified as a Japanese supply cache 2 miles inland from the coastal positions. Standard operation, the kind the battalion had executed dozens of times. Baxter planned to use smoke deception, deploying captured red smoke grenades north of the actual assault route to draw off any reserves. The smoke went up at 06:15. The assault team moved in 60 seconds later, advancing through jungle that seemed unusually quiet. They reached the supply cache location and found it abandoned. Recent abandonment, judging by warm cooking fires and supplies still stacked in orderly rows. Then Japanese machine guns opened up from 3 sides simultaneously. The killing zone had been prepared with care. Interlocking fields of fire, fallback positions for defenders to retreat through. Carefully sighted weapon emplacements that covered every approach. The Japanese had known the Australians were coming, had known roughly when and from which direction, and had prepared accordingly. They'd let the smoke deception succeed, hadn't sent reinforcements to the false signal, because they wanted the assault team to feel confident, to push forward into the trap. Baxter died in the first 30 seconds, shot through the head while trying to organise a withdrawal. Sergeant Willis took command and managed to extract most of the platoon, but 13 men didn't make it out. The bodies stayed there for 2 days because Japanese snipers made recovery impossible. When a larger force finally retrieved the dead on January 20th, they found the supply cache had been completely removed. The entire position had been bait. Davies's report analysing the engagement was brutally honest. Quote, 91 Major Thompson read the report twice, then handed it to Moresby. Quote, 92. Moresby had been thinking about nothing else since the report arrived. Quote, 93. Quote, 94. Quote, 95. Thompson leaned back in his chair, which creaked alarmingly. Outside the headquarters building, rain hammered on the damaged roof with the intensity of tropical storms that turned roads to rivers and camps to swamps. Quote, 96. That was the question that haunted Moresby. Every tactical innovation had a life cycle: introduction, adoption, adaptation, obsolescence. Smoke deception was somewhere between adaptation and obsolescence, still useful in some contexts, dangerous in others. But you couldn't just abandon a technique that had saved lives and expect nothing to replace it. Nature abhorred tactical vacuums. The solution came from an unexpected source. On February 3rd, a signals intelligence officer named Lieutenant Chen brought Moresby a stack of intercepted Japanese radio communications. Chen was Chinese-Australian, one of the few soldiers in the division who could read Japanese, and he'd been tracking enemy communications patterns for 6 months. Quote 97, Chen explained, spreading the intercepts across Moresby's desk. These are 3 different Japanese units operating in the Madang sector. They're all using different smoke signal codes now. Unit A changed their signals in December. Red means medical evacuation, white means reinforcements. Unit B kept the original system. Unit C abandoned coloured smoke entirely and is using flag signals instead. None of them coordinated the changes, so they can't support each other effectively. Moresby studied the intercepts. Japanese commanders were complaining about coordination failures, about reinforcements going to wrong positions, about medical teams arriving at combat outposts instead of field hospitals. The smoke deception had worked so well that it had broken Japanese trust in their entire communication system, and they'd responded by fragmenting into incompatible local solutions. Quote 99, Thompson said, reading over Moresby's shoulder. Their defensive coordination is collapsing. Not collapsing, fragmenting. Each unit is solving the smoke signal problem individually, which means they've lost standardization. That's actually worse for them than if they'd all changed to the same new system. Chen nodded. And it creates opportunities. If we know Unit A uses red for medical, but Unit B uses red for reinforcements, we can tailor our deceptions to specific enemy units. Hit Unit A with false medical signals. Hit Unit B with false reinforcement signals. They'll respond according to their local protocols without realizing we're exploiting the differences. The implications crystallized slowly. Smoke deception had moved beyond simple tactical trickery into something more complex. Exploitation of enemy fragmentation and communication breakdown. The Japanese had responded to Australian deception by destroying their own signal standardization, which created vulnerabilities that could be exploited if you had good intelligence about which units used which signals. But that required detailed, current intelligence about enemy signal protocols across different units. It required signals intercept capability, prisoner interrogations, captured documents, and analytical work to connect all the pieces. Most frontline commanders didn't have access to that intelligence, didn't have Chen's language skills, or the time to analyze enemy communications. The technique was becoming too complex for improvisation. What had started as Corporal Davies throwing captured smoke grenades was evolving into something that required intelligence support, coordination with signals units, and careful planning. The simplicity that made it effective at Saddleburg was gone. Moresby drafted a proposal for division headquarters. Establish small tactical deception teams attached to each battalion, staffed with soldiers who had signals intelligence training and access to current information about enemy communication protocols. The teams would advise battalion commanders on when and how to employ smoke deception based on which Japanese units they faced and what signals those units currently used. Thompson approved the proposal. Division headquarters approved it. The first tactical deception teams deployed in mid-February, each consisting of 2 or 3 soldiers with language training and intelligence backgrounds. The results were mixed. Some teams proved effective, providing actionable intelligence that helped battalion commanders exploit Japanese communication fragmentation. Other teams struggled to get current intelligence, worked with commanders who didn't trust staff advice, or simply lacked the battlefield experience to know when deception was practical versus suicidal. On February 28th, one of the new tactical deception teams advised an assault on Japanese positions near Alexishafen. The team had intelligence indicating the enemy unit used green smoke for officer presence, suggested deploying green smoke as a deception to suggest high-value targets in a false location. The assault went in. The deception worked. Japanese forces responded exactly as predicted. 8 Australian casualties instead of the projected 25. On March 4th, a different tactical deception team provided bad intelligence to a company commander, suggesting smoke deception would work against a Japanese unit that had actually abandoned smoke signals 2 weeks earlier. The assault failed catastrophically. 19 dead, 11 wounded, the company commander requesting court-martial charges against the intelligence team for negligence. Moresby read both reports and understood that the technique had outgrown anyone's ability to control it. Too many variables, too many units using it differently, too much dependence on intelligence that might be current or might be weeks out of date. Smoke deception had become simultaneously more sophisticated and less reliable. By the time the war ended in August 1945, smoke deception had become a footnote in tactical manuals, mentioned briefly, categorized under psychological warfare techniques, taught to officers as an example of adaptive battlefield innovation. The formal doctrine emphasized flexibility, warned against overuse, recommended integration with signals intelligence. It was bloodless and bureaucratic, stripped of everything that had made it urgent and necessary in the jungles of New Guinea. Moresby returned to Sydney in September and found civilian life bewildering in ways combat had never been. People worried about ration coupons and housing shortages and whether their football team would win the premiership. Nobody asked about tactical deception or Japanese smoke signals or the mathematics of casualties avoided. He got a job with the Postal Service, married a woman he'd known before the war, and tried not to think about the 13 men who died at CO, trusting a technique he'd helped develop. Davies stayed in the army for 2 more years, serving with occupation forces in Japan, then returned to Queensland and the sheep station he'd enlisted to escape. He kept one captured Japanese smoke grenade as a souvenir, stored in a box in his shed, alongside tools and spare parts. Sometimes he'd take it out and examine it, remembering the bunker raid in September 1943 when he'd first noticed the color patterns, remembering Moresby asking him what if we used their signals against them, remembering all the small moments that led to something larger. The official military histories, published in the 1950s, credited smoke deception with reducing Australian casualties during the Huon Peninsula campaign by an estimated 15 to 20%. The figure was probably accurate, derived from statistical analysis comparing projected versus actual losses across engagements where smoke deception was employed. 15 to 20% translated to roughly 200 soldiers who lived instead of died, went home instead of staying buried in New Guinea soil. But the histories didn't capture the complexity of how the technique evolved and degraded, how Japanese forces adapted and Australian forces counter-adapted, how what worked at Saddleburg failed at CO, how intelligence and improvisation and dumb luck all played roles impossible to quantify in statistical summaries. They certainly didn't capture the moral ambiguity of innovation that saved lives in October and cost lives in January, or the question of whether developing the technique at all was worth the casualties that occurred when it stopped working reliably. Moresby never spoke about smoke deception in the rare interviews he gave to military historians researching the New Guinea campaign. When pressed, he'd say it was one tactical approach among many, that its significance had been exaggerated, that the real credit belonged to soldiers like Davies, who'd made the observations that mattered. The historians generally accepted this at face value and moved on to questions about broader strategic concerns. Davies was more direct when asked. "We threw colored smoke in wrong directions because we were tired of dying in right ones," he told an interviewer in 1968, 25 years after the fact. "Worked for a while, then it didn't. That's warfare. You try things, some work temporarily, you move on. Anyone telling you different is selling something or wasn't there." The technique itself never completely disappeared. Military forces in later conflicts experimented with signal deception, electronic warfare, psychological operations, all variations on the same fundamental concept of exploiting enemy communication and trust. The specific details changed with technology. Radio replaced smoke, then encrypted communications replaced radio, then digital networks replaced everything. But the underlying principle remained. Anything reliable enough to coordinate defensive action was reliable enough to be exploited through deception. In the end, smoke deception mattered not because it revolutionized warfare, but because it demonstrated how tactical innovation emerged from soldiers noticing patterns, asking questions, and being desperate enough to try unconventional solutions. Davies noticing colored smoke, Moresby connecting it to reinforcement timing, the unauthorized bunker raid testing the theory, Major Hutchins willing to approve something that sounded absurd on paper. All the small decisions that accumulated into something larger, then degraded through enemy adaptation, then evolved again into something more complex and fragile. The men who invented it rarely talked about it afterward, not because they were secretive, but because it felt simultaneously important and trivial. Important because it saved lives. Trivial because it was just colored smoke thrown in wrong directions. Just one small tactical adjustment in a war full of adjustments. Just soldiers trying not to die and trying to help their mates survive. Nothing glorious, nothing that changed history's course. Just young men being clever and desperate in the jungle heat, trusting patterns they'd observed and hoping those patterns held long enough to matter. Most of them took the memories to their graves without fanfare or recognition, which seemed appropriate for a technique that succeeded through misdirection and deliberate confusion. The smoke cleared decades ago. The men are gone. What remains are incomplete records, fading memories, and the question of whether 200 saved lives justified the complexity and the failures and the 13 men at CO who died in an ambush, made possible partly because the enemy had learned to read deception as intelligence. If this story interested you, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment with your thoughts on tactical innovation and the evolution of warfare.